Hello and welcome to India Reads. We are reading My Early Life by Rabindranath Tagore. Now I've got better light here, so I hope I can see better and I should be able to read better. Let me get this light a little closer. Yeah, here we are. So we start with chapter 4. We've seen Tagore's, in the first three chapters, we saw that Tagore was homeschooled. His companions were his sister's son, who was his age, and his elder brother. And when they started to go to school, he also wanted the the home tutor that they had suggested that it might not be, he might not enjoy it, but Tagore insisted and he went to school and he obviously hated it. So the first three chapters covered a little bit about his school, a little bit about his house, and a little bit about his childhood. So let's start with chapter 4, The Child's World. To call our inner garden a garden is to say a deal too much. Its properties consisted of a citron tree, a couple of plum trees of different varieties, and a row of coconut trees. In the center was a paved circle, the cracks of which various grasses and weeds had invaded and planted in them their victorious standards. Only those flowering plants which refused to die of neglect continued uncomplainingly to perform their respective duties without casting any aspersions on the gardener. In the northern corner was a rice husking shed where the inmates of the inner apartments would frequently foregather when household necessity demanded. This last vestige of rural life has since owned defeat and slunk away unashamed and unnoticed. Nonetheless, I suspect that Adam's Garden of Eden, I'm sorry, it's quite bad. Adam's Garden of Eden could hardly have been better adorned than this one of ours, for he and his paradise were alike naked. They needed not to be furnished with material things. It is only since his tasting the fruit of the tree of knowledge until he can fully digest it that man's need for external furniture and embellishment persistently grows. Our inner garden was my paradise. It was enough for me. I well remember how, in the early autumn dawn, I would run there as soon as I was awake. A scent of dewy grass and foliage would rush to meet me, and the morning, with its cool, fresh sunlight, would peep out at me over the top of the eastern garden wall, from below the trembling tassels of the coconut palms. There is another piece of vacant land to the north of the house, which to this day we call the Golabari, which is the barn house. The name shows that in some remote past this must have been a place where the year's store of grain used to be kept in the barn. Then, as with brother and sister in infancy, the likeness between town and country were visible all over. Now the family resemblance can hardly be traced. The Golabari would be my holiday haunt if I got the chance. It would be hardly correct to say that I went there to play. It was not a place to play which drew me. Why this was so is difficult to tell. Perhaps its being a deserted piece of wasteland lying in an out of the way corner gave it its charm for me. It was entirely outside the living quarters and bore no stamp of usefulness. Moreover, it was as unadorned as it was useless, for no one had ever planted anything there. It was doubtless for these reasons that the desert spot offered no resistance to the free play of a boy's imagination. Whenever I got any loophole to evade the vigilance of my wardens and could continue to reach the Golabari, I felt I had a holiday indeed. There was yet another place in our house which I have not yet succeeded in finding out. A little girl's a little girl playmate of my age called it the King's Palace. I have been there, she would sometimes tell me, but somehow the propitious moment never arrived when she could take me along with her. This that was a wonderful place with its playthings were as wonderful as the games that were played there. It seemed to me it must be somewhere near, perhaps in the first or the second story. The only thing was that no one ever seemed to get there. How often have I asked my companion, only tell me, is it really inside the house or outside? And she would always reply, "No, no, it's in this very house." I would sit and wonder, where can it be? Don't I know all the rooms of this house? Who the king might be, I never cared to inquire. Where his palace is still remains, while his palace still remains undiscovered, this much was clear: the king's palace was within our house. Looking back on our childhood days, the thing that recurs most often is the mystery which used to fill both life and world. Something undreamt of was lurking everywhere, and the uppermost question every day was when, oh, when would we come across it? It was as if nature held something in her closed hands and was smiling, asking us, "What do you think I have?" What was impossible for her to have was a thing I had no idea at all. Well, I do remember the custard apple seed which I had planted kept in a corner of the south veranda and used to water every day. The thought that this seed might grow into a tree kept me in great state of fluttering wonder. Custard apple seeds will have the habits of sprouting, but no longer to the accompaniment of that feeling of wonder. The fault is not in the custard apple but is in the mind. We had once stolen some rocks from an elder cousin's rockery and started a little rockery of our own. The plants which we sowed in the interstices were cared for so excessively that it only began that it was only because of their vegetable nature that they managed to put up with it until their untimely death. Words cannot recount the endless joy and wonder with which this miniature mountaintop held for us. We had no doubt that this creation of ours would be a wonderful thing for elites too. The day that we sought to put this to the proof, however, the hillock in the corner of our room with all its rocks and its vegetation vanished. The knowledge that the schoolroom floor was not proper foundation for the erection of the mountain was imparted so rudely. So basically, impacted so rudely. So basically, they've taken the stones and used it somewhere else. And with such suddenness, it gave us such a considerable shock. The weight of stone, of which the floor was relieved, settled on our minds when we realized the gulf between our fancies and the will of our elders. How intimately did the life of the world throb for us in those days? Water, earth, foliage, the sky, they all spoke to us and would not be disregarded. How often we were struck by the poignant regret that we could only see the upper story of earth and knew nothing of the inner story. All our planning was to how we could pry beneath the dust colored cover. If thought we should drive in bamboo after bamboo, one over the other, and we might perhaps get into some sort of touch with its innermost depths. During the Magh festival, a series of wooden pillars used to be planted outside the outer courtyard for supporting the chandeliers. Digging holes for these would begin on the first day of the Magh. The preparations for the festivity are ever interesting to the young folk, but this digging had a special attraction for me. Though I had watched it done year after year and seen the hole grow bigger and bigger till the digger had completely disappeared inside, and but nothing extraordinary, nothing word of the quest of the prince or knight had ever appeared. Every time I had the feeling that the lid was being lifted off the chest of mystery, I felt that bit, there was a little bit more digging to do. Year after year passed, but that bit never got done. There was a pull in the curtain, but it was not drawn. The elders thought I can do whatever they please to do with they rest content with do they rest content with such shallow delving. If we young folks had the ordering of it, the innermost mystery of the earth would no longer be allowed to remain smothered in its dust covering. And the thought that behind every part of the vault of blue reposed the mysteries of the sky would also spur our imagination. Where when our pundit in illustration of some lesson in our Bengali science primer told us that the blue sphere was not an enclosure, how thunderstruck we were. Put ladder upon ladder, said he, and go on mounting away, for you'll never bump your head. Life must be a sparing of this ladders, I opined, and questioned with a rising inflection. And what if we put more ladders and more and more? When I realized that it was fruitless multiplying ladders, I remained dumbfounded, pondering over the matter. Surely I concluded that such an astonishing piece of news must be known only to those who are the world's schoolmasters. So with this we end chapter 4 and let's move to chapter 5. The rule of the servants. Tagore returns to the subject of chapter 2, the treatment of the children by the servants. Of most of the tyrants of our childhood, I remember only their cuffings and the boxings and nothing more. Only one personality stands out in my memory. His name was Ishwar, and he had been living in a village as a schoolmaster before. He was prim, proper, and sedately dignified personage. The earth seemed too earthy for him, with too little water to keep it sufficiently clean, for so that he had to be in a constant state of warfare with its chronic soiled state. He would shoot his water pot into the tank with a lightning movement so as to get his supply from an uncontaminated depth. It was he who had, when bathing in the tank, would be continually thrusting away the surface impurities till he took a sudden plunge, expecting, as it were, to catch the water unawares. When walking, his right arm stood out at an angle from his body, and so it seemed he could not trust the cleanliness of even his own garments. His whole bearing had the appearance of an effort to keep clear of imperfections which, though through unguarded avenues, find entrance into earth, water, air, and into the ways of men. If unfathomable was the depth of his gravity, with head slightly tilted, he would mince his carefully selected words in deep voice. His literary diction would give food for merriment to our elders. Behind his back, some of his high flown phrases finding a permanent place in our family's repertoire of witticisms. But I doubt whether the expressions he used would sound as remarkable today, showing how literal and spoken languages, which used to be as sky from earth asunder, were now coming nearer and nearer. This erstwhile schoolmaster had discovered a way of keeping us quiet in the evenings. Every evening he would gather us round a cracked castor oil lamp and read out to us the stories of Ramayana and Mahabharata. Some of the other students would also come and join the audience. The lamp would be throwing huge shadows uh, right up to the beams of the roof. The little house friends catching insects on the wall, the bats doing a mad dervish dance round and round the veranda outside, and we listening in silent, open mouthed wonder. I still remember on the evening we came to the story of Kusha and Lava, and those two valiant lads were threatening to humble to dust the renown of their father and uncles. How the tense silence of that dimly lighted room was bursting with eager anticipation. It was getting late. Our prescribed period of wakefulness was drawing to a close, and yet the denouncement was far off. At this critical juncture, my father's old follower, Kishori, came to our rescue and finished the episode for us at express speed. To the quick step of the Susiya's jingly verses. The Susiya is the author of this version of Ramayana that they were reading. The impression of the soft, shallow chant of Kritivasa's. Okay, the Susriyas is the composer, and Kritivasa is the writer of this particular version of Ramayana. Um Kritivasa's 14 syllable measure was swept clean away, and we were left overwhelmed with a flood of rhymes and alliterations. On some occasions, the readings would give rise to Shastric discussions, which would be at length be settled by depth of Ishwar's wise pronouncements. Though, as one of the children's servants, his rank in our domestic society was below that of where many many, yet as with grandfather Bhishma in the Mahabharata, his supremacy would assert itself in the seat below his juniors. Our grave and reverent servitor had one weakness for for the sake of his historical accuracy, I feel bound to allude. He used to take opium. This created a craving for rich food, so when he brought us our morning goblets of milk, the forces of attraction in his mind would be greater than those of repulsion. If we give least expression to our natural repugnance for this meal, no sense of responsibility for our health could prompt him to press it on for the second time. So basically, you take all their food away. Ishwar also held somewhat narrow views as to one's capacity for solid nourishment. We would sit down to our evening repast, and the quality of luchis luchi is a fruit. Luchis heaped on a thick round wooden tray would be placed before us. He would begin by gingerly dropping a few on the platter from a sufficient height to safeguard blame from the contamination, like unwilling favors wrestled from the gods by the dint of inopportunity did they descend, so dexterously inhospitable was he. Next would come the inquiry of whether he should give us more. I knew the reply which would be most gratifying, and could not bring myself to deprive him to ask for another helping. Then again, Ishwar was interested with the family allowance of money for procuring our afternoon light refreshments. He would ask us every morning what we would like to have. We knew that to mention the cheapest would be accounted here, and so sometimes we ordered a light reflection of puffed rice, and at others an indigestible one of boiled gram or roasted peanuts. It was evident that Ishwar was not as painstakingly punctilious in regard to our diet as with Shastric properties. So I'm going to stop here. We've kind of finished two chapters. This one is on the servants. This is chapter 5, and chapter 4 is about the child's world. Child's world talks about his garden, and chapter 5 talks about his particular servant. So let's start with chapter 4, where he talks about the garden. They had a garden in as part of their house. This garden was not very well taken care of. There were leaves and there were grass which are sprouting in places where they are not supposed to be growing, and there was not much of a gardener for it, but there were some very interesting plants also. There were coconuts, there was plums, and then there were other plants. Now Tagore and his kids friends, which was his elder brother and his sister's son, the group kind of started picking on someone else's rock collection, and they started collecting the rocks. So they reached a stage where they had built a mountain of rocks in the garden, and they wanted to show it to the adults. But before they could call the adults, the rocks had vanished. Obviously somebody has come and seen it and felt that it was spoiling the garden and not letting the plants grow, and obviously not looking that great. The kids were very shocked about it. They wondered what happened, and this is an incident which is kind of imprinted in Tagore's memory. What else is there in the child's world? Yes, there is another place in the house. There are two more places in the house which he talks about. One is a barn or a storage area which is within the compound of his house, but far away from the place that they stay. So they basically have an open area, a kind of greenery, and then there is this area where the grains are stored. This was a huge area, and Tagore used to love it, and whenever he used to get an opportunity, which was in the afternoons or when the servants were relaxing, he would go there. And if he makes it there, he would consider it as a treat, like a holiday. and it was not that the place had something very special about it. It was the old charm and the fact that there was nothing in it attracted him to it. And also nobody would go there, so there was no disturbance for him. He could go whenever he want and spend as much time as he wanted and come back. The next place which is intriguing him and which he could never find out was a palace in their house. Now, a girl playmate of his said that there was a palace in the house, and Tagore kept searching for the palace. He was wondering because the house was two stories. Was it in the first one or the second one? And he would always wonder. He'd tell the girl that next time when you go to see the king, please take me along, and which the girl never did. And Tagore always kept searching for the palace. It never occurred to him that how big a palace would be there inside the house, because he asked her, is it inside or outside? She said yes, it's inside. So this is a very interesting read in this chapter. Then we move on to the next chapter, where he talks exclusively about how his servants treated him. This is something that he's covered in chapter 2 also, but here he dwells into it more deeply. He talks about a particular gentleman servant, Ishwar, who used to take care of him. Now Ishwar was a retired schoolmaster, so it's not that he was not used to kids. He was somebody who was very fairly comfortable with the kids. And Tagore and his companions also started building a relationship with him. He was obviously perpetually hungry, and so if there was when food was served for the children, he would obviously look at them to see if they would sacrifice a little, and the children were quite happy to sacrifice some of their food so that he could eat more than his share. He could have that extra piece of roti or a little bit more rice, so that he was happy and satisfied. Also, he used to get an allowance of he used to get an allowance every day to take care of the afternoon food of the children. When he would ask the children what they wanted, they obviously would select the cheapest item so that he had the money to eat whatever he wanted. Ishwar was somebody who spent a lot of time with uh, uh, with with Rabindranath, and so Rabindranath kind of knew him very well. Uh, yeah, I don't think there's anything more here. There's only one not so good thing about him which Tagore mentions, which is that he had a habit of taking opium, and the minute he finished taking opium, he would feel very hungry and he would crave for rich food. So that's where the saving of money and the leftovers from what Tagore and his companions would leave, plus his own quota of food, covered for it. Uh, yeah, that's about it in these two chapters. This is quite interesting. It's quaint, it's special. It transports you to that world, and let's see how this book goes. I am hoping that this book will get over in another 3 or 4 readings, and let's see if there's something more interesting which is going to come. As of now, it's okay. I'm saying that you get a glimpse of his life, you get a glimpse of how life would have been in a in an urban setup, which is Calcutta. The Golabari incidentally is something which is reminiscent of the rural parts of India, and so it's a mix of urban and rural, which Tagore also mentions. He kind of, the metaphor that he uses is like a brother and sister who have identical habits and features, but they are a little different. So that's how a city and village life is used is represented by Tagore. With this, I'm coming to the end of today's reading. I hope that you're enjoying. Do share your comments and suggestions, and I will see you in the next chapter. Till then, take care. Goodbye.